In the lowland rainforest of northern Guatemala, far from any road and deeper into the jungle than most people will ever travel, there are temples. Not the scattered stones of a ruin picked over by centuries of treasure hunters, not the low foundations of a settlement that time has reduced to an outline in the earth, but temples. Massive stepped pyramids of limestone rising 60 meters and more above the forest floor, their summits emerging through the canopy into open sky, their stairways worn by the feet of a civilization that built them, used them, and then walked away. The tallest of them can be seen from miles away when the angle is right, a stone peak appearing above the green ocean of the jungle like the tip of something enormous that is mostly hidden. Up close, the scale becomes overwhelming. The blocks of stone are huge, the flights of stairs are steep, and the temples themselves are not simply large buildings but statements, declarations in limestone of the power and the cosmic ambitions of the city that built them. The city is Tikal. Its Maya name, in the language of the people who built it and inhabited it for more than 1,000 years, carries meanings that scholars have debated, but the name most commonly associated with it in Maya epigraphy is Mutal, and it was under that name, or variants of it, that it was known across the Maya world at the height of its power. The name Tikal itself is a later coinage, derived from a Maya word sometimes translated as the place of the spirit voices, though this translation too has been questioned and revised by specialists over the decades. What is not in question is the scale of what was built here, or the duration of the civilization that built it, or the completeness with which that civilization disappeared from this place and left the jungle to reclaim what had taken centuries to construct. Tikal was, at its height, one of the largest and most powerful cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its central core, the area of dense monumental construction visible to visitors today, covers an area of roughly 16 square kilometers, but the full extent of the ancient city, including the residential zones that spread outward from the central core through the jungle, has been estimated at 60 square kilometers or more. At the peak of its population, in the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, Tikal may have been home to somewhere between 60 and 90,000 people, a population comparable to that of many contemporary European cities of the same period and sustained entirely by the agricultural productivity of the surrounding lowland landscape. This documentary is the story of that city. It is the story of the landscape that sustained it, the political and military history that shaped its rise and its conflicts with other powerful Maya centers, the intellectual and artistic achievements of the civilization that flourished here across more than 1,500 years of continuous occupation, the circumstances of the abandonment that left it to the jungle, and the long process of rediscovery that has brought it back, partially and imperfectly, into the understanding of the modern world. It is also the story of what the jungle did to it in the centuries when it was left alone, and of what is still being discovered beneath the trees. Tikal occupies a place in the history of the ancient Americas that is comparable in scale and significance to the great cities of the ancient Old World. It was not simply a large settlement but a political capital, an economic center, a religious headquarters, and an intellectual hub all at once, the kind of place whose existence and whose eventual disappearance changes the history of the region around it in ways that can still be traced 1,000 years after it was abandoned. The story of Tikal is the story of what the Maya lowland civilization was at its fullest expression, and of what happened to that expression when the conditions that had made it possible were withdrawn. The landscape of the Petén region of northern Guatemala, where Tikal is located, is one of the most biologically rich and, for the purposes of large-scale human civilization, one of the most demanding environments in the Americas. The Petén is a limestone plateau, flat to gently rolling, covered by dense tropical rainforest that receives between 1 and 2 meters of rain per year, most of it concentrated in a wet season that runs from roughly May to November. The dry season, from December to April, is genuinely dry, and the management of water across this seasonal alternation was one of the central engineering challenges of Maya civilization in this region. The limestone underlying the Petén is porous, absorbing rainfall rapidly and offering few natural surface water sources. There are no rivers near Tikal. There are no permanent lakes. The water that the city needed for its population of tens of thousands had to be collected from rainfall, stored in the large reservoirs that the Maya engineers cut into the limestone bedrock around the central core of the city, and managed carefully across the dry season to ensure that supplies lasted until the rains returned. The soils of the Petén are thin and nutrient-poor by temperate zone standards, but the Maya farmers who worked them over many centuries developed a sophisticated agricultural system that was capable of supporting a large and dense urban population. The milpa system, in which plots of forest were cleared, burned to release nutrients from the vegetation into the soil, cultivated for a period of years, and then left to fallow while new plots were cleared and cultivated, was the foundation of Maya lowland agriculture, but the evidence from Tikal and other major Maya sites suggests that this system was supplemented by more intensive techniques. Raised fields in the seasonally flooded areas near seasonal wetlands, terrace agriculture on the gentle slopes around the central core, and the management of forest resources in ways that provided food, medicine, and raw materials alongside the primary crops of maize, beans, and squash. The jungle itself was not simply a backdrop to the civilization that developed in it, but an active part of its environment in ways that both supported and constrained what was possible. The trees of the Petén provided timber for construction and fuel, resins and pigments for craft production, food in the form of fruits and seeds, and the raw materials for the bark paper on which Maya scribes recorded the astronomical observations, historical records, and ritual calendars that were the intellectual achievements of the civilization. The animals of the jungle, the deer and the peccary and the tapir and the many species of bird, provided food and feathers and skins and bones that were used in craft production and in the ritual performance that was central to Maya political and religious life. The specific geography of the Tikal area within the broader Petén landscape shaped the development of the city in ways that are still being understood through ongoing archaeological research. The site is located on a low ridge between two seasonal wetlands, locally called bajos, that provided the catchment basins for the reservoir system that supplied the city with water. The ridge itself, slightly elevated above the surrounding landscape, provided stable ground for the massive stone construction of the ceremonial core and offered a natural defensible position that may have been one of the factors in the initial choice of this location for settlement. The surrounding Bajo landscape, while seasonally flooded and therefore unsuitable for conventional agriculture, was managed by the Maya as a resource zone for wetland agriculture and for the extraction of materials that were not available on the drier ridge top. The human occupation of the Tikal area begins well before the construction of the monumental architecture that defines the site today, and the deep history of settlement here is one of the most important contexts for understanding what Tikal eventually became. The earliest evidence of human presence at the site dates to approximately 1000 before the Common Era, during what archaeologists call the Middle Pre-Classic period of Maya civilization. These early inhabitants were farmers who cleared small plots of the lowland forest for cultivation and built modest structures of perishable materials, wood and thatch and mud, that have left only indirect traces in the archaeological record. But they also began the process of constructing in stone, and the earliest stone platforms and simple structures found beneath the later monumental buildings of the central core date to this early period, establishing the principle that this location was a place worth investing in that would persist for the next 2,000 years. The transition from the modest early settlements to the beginnings of true monumental construction, the building of large stone platforms and pyramid bases that would eventually grow into the great temples, occurred during what archaeologists call the late pre-classic period, roughly 300 before the Common Era to 250 of the Common Era. This was the period when the basic organizational and architectural vocabulary of Maya lowland civilization was being established across the region, and Tikal was among the leading sites in this process. The North Acropolis, which would become one of the most sacred precincts of the later city, was already a substantial complex of platforms and temples by the end of the pre-classic period, built up through multiple episodes of construction in which new structures were placed over earlier ones in a pattern of ritual renewal that continued for more than 1,000 years. The relationship between Tikal and the great pre-classic city of El Mirador, located about 60 kilometers to the north in the Guatemalan jungle, is one of the most significant and still incompletely understood aspects of the early history of the region. El Mirador was, in its peak period around 300 before the Common Era, probably the largest city in the ancient Americas, with its massive triadic pyramids dwarfing even the great temples of Tikal at their height. The decline of El Mirador in the first centuries of the Common Era, which remains incompletely explained, may have been one of the factors that contributed to the rise of Tikal as the dominant center of the southern Petén in the classic period that followed. The population and resources that had supported El Mirador did not disappear when that city declined. Some portion of them were redistributed across the regional landscape, and Tikal was positioned to capture a significant share of that redistribution. The early classic period, from roughly 250 to 550 of the Common Era, saw Tikal emerge as a major power in the Maya lowlands, building monumental architecture at a scale that surpassed all but a handful of contemporary sites, developing the political and administrative institutions of a city-state capable of projecting power across a wide region, and establishing the dynastic tradition that would produce some of the most celebrated rulers in Maya history. The great early classic tombs found beneath the temples of the North Acropolis, with their rich assemblages of jade and ceramic and carved bone, testify to the wealth and the organizational capacity of the emerging Tikal state in this period. The inscriptions that record the names and the deeds of the early dynastic rulers, though often fragmentary and difficult to interpret, provide glimpses of a political world of warfare and alliance and ritual performance that would define Maya political culture throughout the classic period. The classic period of Tikal, spanning roughly 500 years from 250 to 800 of the Common Era, is the period that produced the great temples and the rich historical record that make the site so significant today, and it was a period of extraordinary achievement alongside intense political conflict. The political history of classic Tikal is dominated by the city's relationship with two other major powers: Calakmul, the great city in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche that was Tikal's primary rival for dominance in the Maya lowlands, and Teotihuacan, the massive city in central Mexico that exerted a profound influence on the political culture of the entire Mesoamerican region in the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era. The interaction between Tikal and these two powers shaped the city's history more decisively than any internal development, and understanding the outline of that interaction is essential for understanding what Tikal was and what it achieved. The connection between Tikal and Teotihuacan, which lies more than 1,000 kilometers to the northwest, is one of the more dramatic findings of 20th-century Maya archaeology. In the year 378 of the Common Era, according to the historical record preserved in Maya inscriptions, a figure named Siaj-Kak, which translates roughly as "fire is born," arrived at Tikal from the west. On the same day, the reigning king of Tikal died. Shortly afterward, the throne passed to a new dynasty whose founder bore a name and used imagery and symbols associated with Teotihuacan rather than with the traditional Maya royal tradition. The interpretation of these events is still debated among specialists. Some argue that Siaj-Kak represented a military conquest by Teotihuacan or a Teotihuacan-aligned power, others that the event was a more complicated political arrangement, perhaps an alliance that brought a foreign claimant to the throne with the support of at least some factions within Tikal itself. What is clear is that the arrival of this Teotihuacan-connected figure transformed the political character of Tikal in ways that had lasting consequences for its subsequent development. The period following the Teotihuacan connection saw Tikal become the dominant power in the southern Maya lowlands, projecting military and political influence across a wide region and establishing client relationships with smaller cities that provided tribute and alliance. But this dominance was not unchallenged. Calakmul, which the ancient Maya knew as the Kingdom of the Snake, was building its own power to the north, and by the 6th century of the Common Era it had assembled a coalition of cities and client states that surrounded Tikal and positioned it for attack. In 562, a military defeat at the hands of a Calakmul allied force led to what scholars call the hiatus, a period of approximately a century and a half during which Tikal's monumental construction largely ceased, its historical record went silent, and the city appears to have been politically subordinated to its northern rival. The recovery of Tikal from the hiatus is one of the great political stories of the ancient Maya world. The ruler who achieved it, known to modern scholars by his accession name Siaj Chan Kawil and by the sobriquet the Great Jaguar Paw, began the political and military campaign that would restore Tikal's independence, but it was his successor, the ruler known as Nun Ujal Chak and especially the great king Jasa Chan Kawil, who completed the recovery. In 695, Jasa Chan Kawil defeated the king of Kalakmul in battle, capturing him and apparently sacrificing him as part of the triumphant ritual that accompanied the victory. This defeat did not immediately end Kalakmul's power, but it broke the political stranglehold that the northern city had maintained over Tikal for more than a century, and it inaugurated the final great period of Tikal's florescence, the period that produced the largest and most spectacular of the great temples. The temples of Tikal are the most immediate and most powerful evidence of what the city achieved at the height of its power, and they remain among the most impressive architectural monuments in the ancient Americas. Temple I, known as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises approximately 47 meters above the great plaza that it faces. It was built by Jasa Chan Kawil, or completed under his direction, and it served as his funerary monument, built over the tomb in which he was interred with an extraordinary assemblage of jade ornaments, carved bone, and other prestigious goods that testified to his wealth and his status as the ruler who had restored Tikal to greatness. The temple's steeply pitched stairway, accessible to those willing to make the climb, leads to a small sanctuary at the summit, and above the sanctuary rises the roof comb, a massive stone superstructure decorated with reliefs that once showed the enthroned king in full royal regalia. The effect of the completed temple, which would have been covered in brilliant white plaster and painted in vivid colors, would have been of a cosmic mountain, a meeting point between the human world and the Divine One, rising from the earth to pierce the sky. Temple II, which faces Temple I across the Great Plaza, is slightly smaller but equally dramatic, and the two temples together frame the open space of the plaza in a way that creates one of the most powerful architectural ensembles in the ancient world. The Great Plaza itself, the large flat ceremonial space between the two temples, was the stage for the public rituals of Tikal's political and religious life. The accession ceremonies that installed new kings, the ball game competitions that served as both sport and ritual enactment of cosmic themes, the public displays of captives and the sacrifices that followed military victories, and the great calendrical ceremonies that marked the significant dates in the Maya astronomical and ritual calendar. Temple IV is the tallest of the Tikal temples, rising approximately 65 meters from its base to the top of its roof comb, making it the tallest pre-Columbian structure in the Americas. It was built by Yikn Chan Kawil, the son and successor of Jasa Chan Kawil, who also defeated a major rival city in battle and continued his father's policy of restoring Tikal's regional dominance. From the summit of Temple IV, on a clear morning, the roof combs of the other great temples emerge above the canopy of the surrounding jungle like the peaks of a submerged mountain range, and the scale of the ancient city becomes apparent in a way that it cannot from ground level. The construction of these massive temples required an organizational capacity and a command of labor and resources that is difficult to fully appreciate from the physical evidence alone. The limestone used in construction was quarried from the bedrock of the site itself, which accounts for the large depressions in the landscape around the central core that the Maya used as reservoirs after the quarrying was complete. The cutting and transport and placement of stone blocks weighing several tons each, without wheeled vehicles and without draft animals, required a large and disciplined labor force organized by an administrative structure capable of managing a major construction project over many years. The mortar that bound the stones, a lime-based material produced by burning limestone in kilns that consumed large quantities of wood, added another dimension of industrial organization to the construction process. The temples were not built by slave labor in the modern imagination's version of ancient construction. The evidence from Mesoamerican societies suggests that major construction projects were organized through systems of tribute labor, in which the population of the city and its surrounding agricultural hinterland contributed labor time as a form of tax to the state. This labor tribute was supplemented by the specialized skills of craft workers and architects who planned and oversaw the construction, and the entire enterprise was embedded in a framework of religious meaning that gave the construction of a temple the character of a cosmic act, a contribution to the maintenance of the universe rather than simply the building of a large structure. The intellectual achievements of Tikal and of classic Maya civilization more broadly are among the most remarkable in the ancient world, and their recovery through the decipherment of the Maya script over the course of the 20th century has transformed the understanding of what this civilization was and what it accomplished. The Maya writing system, developed to its fullest expression during the Classic period, is one of only a handful of fully developed writing systems that arose independently in the history of humanity. It is a logosyllabic system, meaning that it combines signs that represent complete words or morphemes with signs that represent syllables, and it is capable of representing the full range of the spoken language, including its grammar and its phonology, in a way that the more limited systems used by some other ancient American civilizations were not. The decipherment of this script, which accelerated dramatically in the second half of the 20th century through the contributions of scholars working in both the United States and the Soviet Union, has opened the historical record of classic Maya civilization in ways that were simply not possible when the script remained undeciphered and the inscriptions on the monuments were read only for their numerical and calendrical content. What the inscriptions reveal, when read as historical texts, is a political world of remarkable complexity and sophistication. A world of competing city-states, each ruled by a divine king whose authority derived from his claimed descent from the gods and his ability to mediate between the human world and the divine one through ritual performance. The great lords of classic Maya cities waged war, made alliances, celebrated calendrical cycles with elaborate ceremonies, and recorded their deeds and their genealogies in stone inscriptions that were designed to be read and admired by the living and to endure for the gods and for posterity. The narrative of Tikal's history, the defeat by Calakmul and the recovery under Jasa Chan Kawil, the military victories and the building programs and the dynastic succession, is known to us through these inscriptions, which represent one of the richest historical records produced by any ancient American civilization. The Maya calendar system, which is documented in the inscriptions and in the few surviving Maya books, is one of the most sophisticated time-keeping systems developed by any ancient civilization. The Maya used multiple interlocking calendrical cycles simultaneously: a 365-day solar calendar, a 260-day ritual calendar, a Venus cycle of approximately 584 days, and the long count, a linear count of days from a fixed starting point that was the equivalent of a universal calendar allowing precise dating of any event. The long count dating system, which underlies the inscriptions at Tikal and other major classic sites, was capable of recording dates spanning millions of years and reflected a concept of time as cyclical at multiple scales that was central to Maya cosmology. The astronomical knowledge embodied in the Maya calendar was not abstract or purely theoretical, but deeply connected to the practical and ritual life of the city. The orientation of major temples and plazas at Tikal, like those at other classic Maya sites, reflects deliberate alignment with significant astronomical phenomena. The rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, the movements of Venus, and the patterns of the Pleiades star cluster that were important markers in the Maya agricultural and ritual calendar. The architecture of the site was, among other things, an astronomical instrument, a tool for tracking the movements of celestial bodies and maintaining the correspondence between the rhythms of the sky and the rhythms of human life. The political geography of the classic Maya world was not a simple hierarchy with Tikal at its apex, but a complex and constantly shifting network of city-states, alliances, and rivalries that produced the historical record preserved in the inscriptions. The Maya lowlands of the classic period were home to dozens of independent polities, each centered on a royal court and a ceremonial core of stone architecture, each surrounded by an agricultural hinterland populated by the farmers whose labor and tribute supported the court and its institutions. These polities were not isolated from each other but linked by trade routes that moved goods across the entire lowland region and beyond, by marriage alliances that created dynastic connections between royal families, and by the political and military relationships of dominance and subordination, of alliance and enmity, that defined the structure of the regional political system. Tikal's position in this system was never simply that of a dominant power imposing its will on a passive periphery. It was always contested, always subject to challenge from rival centers that had their own claims to regional dominance and their own networks of alliance and client relationships. The alliance system centered on Calakmul, which scholars call the Snake Kingdom after the serpent head emblem glyph that identified that dynasty, was the most sustained and the most damaging of the challenges that Tikal faced, but it was not the only one. Caracol, a major site in what is now western Belize, was the actual military instrument of the 562 defeat of Tikal, and it maintained its own regional ambitions throughout the Classic period. Quirigua, a site in the Motagua Valley of what is now Guatemala, famously captured and killed the king of Copan in 738, in a political drama that illustrates the degree to which the classic Maya world was one of genuine political agency at multiple levels and not simply the dominance of one or two great powers over all others. The trade networks that linked the classic Maya cities were as important as the political and military relationships in shaping the history of Tikal. The city sat at a favorable position in the regional trade network, with access to the routes that moved obsidian from the volcanic highlands of what is now southern Guatemala through the lowlands to the Caribbean coast, and to the routes that moved marine shells, jade, and other prestige goods from their sources to the cities where they were consumed. The control of these trade routes, or at least the ability to tax the goods that moved along them, was one of the economic foundations of Tikal's power, and the political alliances that the city's rulers sought to build and maintain were in part motivated by the desire to secure access to the resources that moved through the trading network. The role of captive-taking in Maya warfare is one of the aspects of classic Maya political culture that the inscriptions document most clearly. Major military victories were celebrated not simply for their political consequences but for the captives they provided, high-status individuals whose capture and eventual sacrifice was a central element of the ritual performance through which Maya kings demonstrated their power and their relationship to the divine world. The sculptures and reliefs at Tikal and other major classic sites show bound captives in postures of submission at the feet of victorious rulers, and the inscriptions record the names and titles of the captives as carefully as they record the names of the kings who captured them, because the status of the captive was part of what gave the sacrifice its ritual power. The daily life of the tens of thousands of people who inhabited Tikal at its height was organized around the productive activities of agriculture and craft production, the social structures of kinship and neighborhood, and the ritual calendar that gave the passage of time its meaning and its rhythm. The great majority of Tikal's population were farmers, living in the dispersed residential zones that surrounded the central core and cultivating the milpa plots and the more intensive agricultural installations in the areas around the site. The residential structures of this agricultural population ranged from modest single-room platforms with perishable superstructures to more substantial multi-room complexes that housed larger and more prosperous families. The material remains of these residential zones, excavated in the large-scale mapping and sampling programs conducted by archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania and other institutions in the 1950s through 1970s, give a picture of a population that was not simply subsistence farmers but participants in a market economy, consuming craft goods from specialized producers and contributing their own labor and agricultural surplus to the tribute system that supported the central institutions of the city. The market system of classic Tikal, which is inferred from the distribution of craft goods in the residential zones rather than directly documented in inscriptions, was probably organized around periodic markets held in the open spaces of the central core or in designated market plazas adjacent to it. The evidence for long-distance trade in high-status goods, jade and obsidian and shell and fine ceramics, suggests that these goods were distributed through the city through a combination of market exchange and elite redistribution, with the royal court serving as both a consumer of prestige goods and as a redistributor of them to subordinate elites whose loyalty was in part maintained through the gift of prestigious objects. The craft production of classic Tikal encompassed a wide range of specialized activities: the carving of jade and obsidian and bone, the production of fine polychrome ceramics, the weaving of cotton textiles, the working of shell into ornaments, the production of the rubber balls used in the ball game, and the writing and painting of bark paper books that recorded the ritual and historical knowledge of the civilization. Most of these crafts were practiced by specialists who lived in the city and whose products circulated through the market and through elite gift exchange, and the concentration of specialized craft production in a large urban center was itself one of the economic advantages of the city over the dispersed rural settlement that surrounded it. The social structure of classic Tikal was hierarchical, organized around the fundamental distinction between the noble class, which included the royal family and the broader elite stratum that staffed the administrative and religious institutions of the city, and the commoner class of farmers and craftspeople who produced the agricultural and craft surplus that supported the elite. Within each of these broad strata there were further gradations of status and wealth, and the boundary between them was not absolutely impermeable. The evidence from the funerary remains suggests that some individuals of relatively modest social origins achieved significant wealth and status through craft production or trade, and that the social structure of the city was more fluid in practice than the formal ideology of elite distinction would suggest. The religious life of Tikal was organized around a cosmology that placed the city and its ruling dynasty at the center of a universe structured by the movements of celestial bodies and animated by the actions of gods and ancestors, whose relationship to the living world required constant maintenance through ritual performance. The Maya cosmos, as it can be reconstructed from the inscriptions and iconography of the classic period, was conceived as a three-part structure: the sky, the earth, and the underworld, each inhabited by different categories of supernatural beings and connected to the human world through specific points and times that were identified by the calendrical system and marked by ritual performance. The Great Ceiba tree, which the Maya understood as the Axis Mundi, the world tree that connected the three levels of the cosmos, was a central symbol of this cosmological structure, and the plazas of Tikal and other major classic sites were understood as representations of the primordial landscape of creation, the place where the gods had established the conditions for human existence. The kings of Tikal were not simply political leaders but the primary ritual specialists of the city, the individuals whose performance of the correct rituals at the correct times maintained the relationship between the human world and the divine one that kept the cosmos functioning. The accession of a new king was understood as a moment of cosmic renewal, the reinvigoration of the connection between the human and divine realms that required elaborate ceremony to establish properly. The death of a king was equally momentous, requiring the complex funerary ritual that sent the deceased ruler to the divine realm while establishing his successor in the position of mediator between the worlds. The ball game, played on the courts that are a standard feature of major classic Maya sites, was one of the most important ritual performances in Maya religious life. The game itself involved keeping a heavy rubber ball in play without using the hands, and it was contested between teams whose identity and the specific rules of play varied across the Maya world and across time. What is consistent is the game's association with fundamental cosmological themes: the movements of celestial bodies, the struggle between the forces of life and death that was played out in the mythological narratives of the Maya creation story, and the sacrifice that followed the game's conclusion. The ball court at Tikal, located adjacent to the Great Plaza, was not a sports venue in the modern sense but a ritual space where the drama of the cosmos was enacted in physical form. The ritual calendar of 260 days that interlocked with the 365-day solar calendar to produce the 52-year calendar round was the primary organizational framework of Maya ritual life. Each of the 260 days had its own deity, its own augury, and its own set of appropriate ritual actions, and the task of the ritual specialist was to identify the character of each day and to perform the actions that would align human activity with the qualities of the day in ways that promoted good outcomes and averted bad ones. The inscriptions at Tikal record the dates of events in both the calendar round and the long count systems, embedding the historical events of the city's political life within the framework of sacred time that gave those events their cosmic significance. The abandonment of Tikal is one of the great historical puzzles of the ancient Americas, and the question of what caused the collapse of classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands in the 9th century of the Common Era has occupied archaeologists and historians for more than a century without producing a consensus answer. The facts of the collapse are clear enough in their broad outlines. Across the southern Maya lowlands, in the century or so centered on 900 of the Common Era, city after city ceased constructing new stone monuments, ceased recording historical events in inscriptions, and was gradually depopulated as the people who had inhabited them moved away or died without being replaced by new generations at the same scale. The last known long count date at Tikal is from 869 of the Common Era. After that date, no new monuments were erected, no new construction was undertaken, and the population of the city declined from its peak of perhaps 70 to 90,000 to a small remnant that persisted for perhaps a century or two before disappearing entirely. The jungle moved into the plazas and grew up the sides of the temples, and within a few centuries there was no visible trace from ground level that the city had ever existed. The proposed explanations for this collapse are numerous and have changed significantly as archaeological knowledge of the period has improved. The earliest explanations tended toward simple narratives of conquest, disease, or environmental catastrophe, but the complexity of the archaeological record has resisted such simple accounts. The current consensus among specialists is that the collapse was a multi-causal phenomenon in which no single factor was sufficient by itself, but in which several reinforcing processes combined to produce an outcome that no single one of them could have produced alone. Among the factors most consistently identified by current research are prolonged drought, political instability and warfare, environmental degradation resulting from intensive agricultural use of the lowland landscape over many centuries, and the disruption of the trade networks that had supported the economic life of the major cities. Paleoclimatological evidence from lake sediments and cave formations in the Maya lowland region has documented a series of severe droughts in the period between roughly 800 and 1000 of the Common Era. Droughts sufficiently prolonged and severe to have significantly reduced agricultural yields and stressed the population in ways that would have made the existing social and political order increasingly difficult to maintain. The reservoir system that supplied Tikal with water through the dry season was large and sophisticated, but it was designed for the normal variation of the regional climate rather than for the kind of multi-year drought that the paleoclimatological record documents for this period. Political instability compounded the environmental stress. The inscription record shows an increasing frequency of warfare among the major Maya centers in the decades before the collapse, and the disruption of trade networks that accompanied this warfare would have reduced the economic resources available to the royal courts that organized and funded the construction projects and the ritual performances that were the most visible expressions of classic Maya civilization. Without the resources to sustain these expressions, the ideological basis of the royal authority that held the city together was undermined, and the population that had been drawn to the city by its economic opportunities and its ritual significance had less reason to remain when those opportunities and that significance diminished. The rediscovery of Tikal by the outside world is a process that began in the 19th century and continues today, as new technologies and new research questions continue to transform the understanding of what is buried in the Petan jungle. The first documented European encounter with Tikal occurred in 1848, when a Guatemalan government expedition led by Modesto Mendez and Ambrosio Tut reached the site and produced a description and illustrations that introduced it to a scholarly audience. But the existence of major ruins in the Petan was known to local Maya communities and to the few non-indigenous people who traveled through the region long before Mendez and Tut's expedition. The site continued to be visited by researchers and explorers through the latter half of the 19th century, and the first systematic photographic documentation of the site was produced in 1877 by Alfred Maudslay, the British explorer whose photographic and cast records of Maya inscriptions and architecture were fundamental to the development of Maya studies as an academic discipline. The major transformation in the understanding of Tikal came with the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Tikal project, which began in 1956 and continued through 1970. This project, which was the largest and most comprehensive archaeological investigation of a Maya site undertaken to that point, produced a detailed map of the central core of the city, excavated a significant number of the major structures and many of the residential complexes of the surrounding areas, and recovered the historical record of the dynasty from the carved monuments and their inscriptions. The findings of the Tikal project established the basic outline of the site's history and its place in the wider history of classic Maya civilization, and much of what is known about Tikal today rests on the foundation laid by the Pennsylvania project. The Guatemalan government's involvement in the management and investigation of the site increased significantly in the years following the Pennsylvania project, and the Instituto de Antropología y Historia of Guatemala has been the primary institutional authority for the site since the 1970s. The national park that surrounds the archaeological zone, established in 1955 and expanded subsequently, protects not only the archaeological remains but the surrounding rainforest, which is one of the most biologically diverse in Central America and which has been a significant attraction for ecotourists as well as for visitors interested in the archaeology. The application of LiDAR technology to the study of Tikal and the broader Petén region in recent years has produced what may be the most significant transformation in the understanding of the site since the Pennsylvania project. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, uses laser pulses from an aircraft to measure the precise elevation of the ground surface beneath the forest canopy, producing a detailed topographic map that reveals the shapes of buried and overgrown structures that are invisible from ground level and from conventional aerial photography. The LiDAR surveys conducted over the Petén in 2016 and subsequent years have revealed that the extent of the ancient city was far greater than previously understood, with thousands of previously unknown structures identified in the areas between and around the known archaeological zones. The scale of the ancient urban landscape, with its complex network of roads, agricultural features, and residential and ceremonial structures spread across a vast area of the forest, suggests a population and a level of landscape modification that significantly exceeds the estimates based on ground-level survey. The experience of visiting Tikal today is one of the most extraordinary available to anyone interested in the ancient world, and it is an experience shaped as much by the living jungle that surrounds the ruins as by the ruins themselves. The approach to the site, through the national park that surrounds it, begins with the forest. The road from the nearest town passes through dense rainforest where the trees press close on both sides and the sounds of the jungle are constant. The calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crash of a branch from the canopy above. Howler monkeys are frequently encountered, their roars filling the forest at dawn and dusk with a sound that has been described as the most powerful vocalization of any land mammal relative to body size, and that the first European travelers through the Petén found deeply unsettling until they identified the source. The wildlife of the park, which includes not only the howler monkeys but spider monkeys, several species of toucan, the great curassow, the ocellated turkey, coatimundi, and on rare occasions the jaguar and the tapir, is as much a part of the Tikal experience as the stone monuments, and the UNESCO World Heritage designation covers the park as a whole rather than just the archaeological zone. The transition from the jungle to the monuments is sudden and dramatic. One moment the path leads through dense forest and the next it opens onto the Great Plaza, the huge rectangular space between Temple I and Temple II, whose flat limestone paving is still mostly intact beneath the growth of grass and the occasional tree that has found a foothold in a crack in the stone. The scale of the plaza and the temples is immediately apparent in a way that photographs do not fully convey. The temples are very large, the plaza is very wide, and the open sky above the cleared central area, after the closeness of the forest, feels like a revelation. The acoustic character of the Great Plaza is one of its most unexpected qualities. The arrangement of the temples and the platform of the North Acropolis that closes the northern end of the plaza creates an echo effect that amplifies and reflects sound in unusual ways, and researchers have suggested that this acoustic property was deliberately engineered by the builders to enhance the experience of the ritual performances that took place in the space. A hand clap at the center of the plaza produces an echo that some listeners describe as resembling the call of the resplendent quetzal, the bird that was one of the most sacred animals in Maya symbolism, a correspondence that, whether or not it was intentional, would have added another layer of meaning to the ritual performances conducted in this space. The climb to the summit of the accessible temples, Temple 2 and Temple 4, is steep and physically demanding, and the view from the summit of Temple 4, the tallest, is one of the most memorable available in the Americas. The forest stretches in every direction to the horizon, broken only by the roof combs of the other great temples emerging above the canopy, and in the early morning before the heat becomes oppressive, the mist that sometimes fills the low areas of the jungle adds an atmosphere to the scene that feels continuous with the world of the ancient Maya who climbed these same steps to perform rituals at the summits of their cosmic mountains. The archaeology of Tikal continues to produce significant new findings decades after the major excavation programs of the mid-20th century, and the picture of the ancient city continues to deepen and become more complex with each new season of fieldwork. The ongoing Proyecto de Arqueología de Tikal, which has continued investigation at the site under Guatemalan direction since the 1980s, has produced important new findings about the earlier phases of the site's occupation, about the relationship between the central core and the surrounding residential zones, and about specific aspects of the city's political and economic life that were not well understood from the earlier work. The excavation of new structures and the re-excavation of structures previously investigated with less sophisticated techniques have produced new chronological information and new categories of material evidence that have refined the picture of the site's development across its long occupation. The study of the human remains from Tikal has been one of the most productive areas of recent research. The skeletal material recovered from the many burials excavated at the site, ranging from the elaborate royal tombs under the major temples to the modest interments in the residential zones, has been subjected to a range of scientific analyses that were not available to the original excavators. Isotopic analysis of tooth enamel can reveal information about the diet and geographic origins of individuals, and the results from Tikal suggest a significant degree of population movement into the city from other regions of the Maya lowlands, consistent with the picture of a major urban center that attracted migrants from across a wide region. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen provides information about the long-term diet of individuals, and the results from different areas of the site show significant differences in diet between individuals of different social status, with elite burials associated with diets richer in animal protein and in high-status foods like cacao. The study of the ancient agricultural landscape around Tikal, using a combination of LiDAR mapping, soil coring, and targeted excavation of specific agricultural features, is producing a much more detailed picture of how the city fed its large population than was possible from the earlier work. The extent and complexity of the modified agricultural landscape around the site, with its network of raised fields, terrace slopes, and managed forest gardens, suggests a level of agricultural intensification that was capable of supporting a much larger population than the conservative estimates based on simple milpa agriculture would allow. The epigraphy of Tikal, the study of the inscriptions carved on the site's monuments, continues to yield new interpretations as the understanding of the Maya writing system advances. Many of the inscriptions at Tikal contain passages whose precise meaning remains uncertain, and new advances in the understanding of Maya grammar and vocabulary are regularly producing new readings of previously opaque texts. The dynastic history of Tikal, which was already among the most complete in the Maya world, continues to be refined as new monuments are discovered or as previously known monuments are reread in the light of new epigraphic understanding. The specific findings of the LiDAR surveys deserve more attention than the headline numbers suggest. Among the structures identified in the surveys but not previously recorded are what appear to be defensive walls and ditches surrounding portions of the city, a discovery that has significant implications for understanding the military character of classic Maya urbanism and for the specific history of Tikal's relationship with its rivals. The identification of what appear to be large reservoirs and agricultural features in the areas between the known archaeological zones is also significant, as it suggests that the modified landscape of the ancient city was even more extensively engineered than the ground-level survey had indicated. The broader significance of Tikal in the history of human civilization is not simply the story of an impressive ancient city, but a contribution to the understanding of what civilizations are and how they work, and what they leave behind when they end. Tikal represents one of humanity's clearest demonstrations that complex urban civilization could arise independently in the tropical lowlands, in an environment that European intellectual tradition had long assumed was inimical to the development of high culture. The assumption, which persisted well into the 20th century, that dense tropical forest was a barrier to the development of complex society rather than a resource that complex society could exploit and manage, has been comprehensively disproved by the evidence from Tikal and the broader Maya lowland region. The city that flourished here for more than 1,000 years was not simply surviving in the jungle but actively shaping it, managing it, and drawing from it the resources that sustained one of the most intellectually and artistically accomplished civilizations of the ancient world. The intellectual achievements of classic Maya civilization, of which Tikal was one of the principal centers, deserve to be considered alongside the achievements of any other ancient civilization in terms of their sophistication and their originality. The development of an independent writing system capable of representing the full range of spoken language, the invention of mathematical concepts including the positional notation system and the concept of zero that the Maya used in their calendrical calculations, the astronomical observations that allowed the precise prediction of solar and lunar eclipses and the movements of Venus. These are achievements that reflect a level of intellectual investment and cumulative knowledge building that is comparable to anything produced by the literate civilizations of the Old World in the same period. The relationship between Tikal and the broader intellectual tradition of the ancient Americas is one that continues to be actively debated and investigated. The question of whether the mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the classic Maya was developed entirely independently or whether it was influenced by contact with other Mesoamerican intellectual traditions, particularly those of the great cities of central Mexico, is not fully resolved. The evidence from Tikal itself, with its documented connection to Teotihuacan in the 4th century, suggests that the intellectual traditions of the Maya lowlands and those of the Mexican highlands were in contact and perhaps in dialogue, even if the precise nature of that dialogue remains uncertain. What is clear is that the intellectual achievements of classic Maya civilization, including those documented at Tikal, were products of sustained human intellectual effort carried out over many generations, and that they deserve to be treated with the same seriousness and the same respect that we extend to the intellectual achievements of ancient Greece or ancient China. The collapse of classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands at the end of the 9th century is, in retrospect, one of the most instructive episodes in the history of human civilization's relationship with its environment. The combination of environmental stress, political instability, and the disruption of the economic systems that had supported the city's population and institutions mirrors, in important ways, the kinds of challenges that contemporary civilizations face from climate change, political fragmentation, and the disruption of the global economic systems on which modern urban populations depend. The lesson of Tikal is not a simple one of civilization's fragility, because the Maya people who abandoned the southern lowland cities did not disappear but rather reorganized themselves in new configurations in different locations, and the Maya civilization continued and continues today in the communities of Maya people across Guatemala, Mexico, and Belize. The lesson is rather about the relationship between a specific civilization and a specific environment, and the limits of what any human organization can sustain when the environmental conditions on which it depends are sufficiently disrupted. The jungle that covers Tikal is not a passive backdrop to the ruins, but an active and dynamic presence that has been shaping the site since the last inhabitants departed more than 1,000 years ago. The process by which the tropical rainforest reclaimed the abandoned city is one of the most dramatic examples of ecological succession in the archaeological record. In the decades immediately following abandonment, The cleared plazas and agricultural fields around the city would have been colonized first by grasses and shrubs, then by the fast-growing pioneer tree species that are characteristic of disturbed tropical forest. Within a generation or two of abandonment, the central plazas of the city would have been forested, and within a century or two the forest would have been dense enough to hide all but the largest structures from anyone moving through it. The temples, because of their height, took longer to be fully covered, and their summits would have remained visible above the forest canopy for a considerable period before the trees growing on their sides and platforms eventually reached a height sufficient to obscure even the roof combs. The trees that grow on and within the ruins are not simply growing on the ruins but actively shaping them. The roots of large trees, seeking water and anchorage in the joints between stone blocks, exert enormous forces as they grow, and the root systems of trees established on the surfaces of temples and platforms over many centuries have in some cases displaced and overturned large stone blocks and opened cracks in the masonry through which water infiltrates and accelerates the deterioration of the lime mortar that binds the stones. The famous photograph of one of the smaller temples at Tikal with a massive tree growing from its summit, its roots cascading down the sides of the pyramid like stone fingers, is an image of this process at an advanced stage. The management of the relationship between the archaeology and the ecology of Tikal is one of the most complex conservation challenges facing the site. The trees that grow within and on the ruins are ecologically important, providing habitat for the wildlife that makes the national park valuable as a biodiversity reserve, but they are also agents of structural damage to the archaeological remains. The removal of trees from the surfaces of structures must be balanced against the need to maintain the ecological integrity of the surrounding forest and the habitat it provides. The decision about which trees to remove and which to leave, and how to manage the ongoing process of forest growth on and around the ruins, requires a continuous dialogue between archaeologists, conservators, and ecologists that reflects the complex dual character of Tikal as both an archaeological site and a nature reserve. The conservation of the physical fabric of the ruins against the combined effects of tree root damage, water infiltration, biological growth, and the mechanical stress of tourist access is an ongoing challenge that requires sustained investment of resources and expertise. The carved stone surfaces of the monuments, exposed to the high humidity and the biological activity of the tropical environment, deteriorate at rates that are significantly faster than those experienced by monuments in drier climates, and the carved panels and relief sculptures that document the history of the ancient city require active conservation intervention to prevent their loss. The relationship between Tikal and the contemporary Maya people of Guatemala is a dimension of the site's significance that has become increasingly central to how it is managed and interpreted. The Maya people of Guatemala, who number in the millions and speak more than 20 distinct Maya languages, are the direct descendants of the people who built and inhabited Tikal and the other great cities of the classic period. This descent is not simply biological but cultural. The Maya communities of contemporary Guatemala maintain many of the practices, the ritual calendar, the cosmological understandings, and the social structures that connect them to their ancient predecessors, even as those traditions have been transformed by more than 500 years of colonial and post-colonial history. The relationship between living Maya communities and the archaeological site of Tikal is therefore not simply that of a contemporary population to a heritage site, but something more intimate and more complex. For many Maya people, Tikal is not primarily an archaeological site or a tourist attraction but a sacred place, a location where the ancestors lived and worked and died, and where the connection between the living and the dead, which is fundamental to Maya religious understanding, can be accessed through ritual. The contemporary Maya ritual known as costumbre, which involves the offering of candles, incense, and other materials at specific locations that have been identified as sacred through the accumulated tradition of the community, is practiced at Tikal and at other ancient Maya sites throughout Guatemala. And the access of Maya ritual specialists to these sites for the performance of their ceremonies is an issue that has required negotiation between the archaeological and governmental authorities, who manage the sites, and the Maya communities who understand them as religious spaces rather than museums. The inclusion of Maya community perspectives in the interpretation and management of Tikal has been a slow and contested process, reflecting the broader political and social history of Guatemala, in which the Maya population has historically been marginalized and its cultural traditions either ignored or suppressed by the dominant non-indigenous society. The peace accords that ended the Guatemalan Civil War in 1996, which included specific provisions recognizing the rights of Maya peoples to their cultural heritage and their ancestral territories, provided a new legal and political framework within which the relationship between Maya communities and the management of sites like Tikal could be renegotiated. The economic dimension of the relationship between Tikal and the surrounding Maya communities is also significant. The National Park and Archaeological Zone generates substantial tourism revenue, and the distribution of that revenue between the central government, the Park Management Authority, and the local communities whose territory borders the park has been a source of ongoing negotiation and sometimes conflict. The development of community-based tourism enterprises that allow local Maya communities to benefit directly from the visitors to the site, through guiding services, craft sales, and hospitality businesses, has been one approach to making the economic benefits of the site's international fame more broadly distributed. The question of what Tikal sounded like, what it smelled like, what it felt like to be a person living in it at the height of its power, is one that the archaeological evidence can only partially answer, but that is worth approaching because it touches on the most fundamental purpose of the historical imagination. The sounds of Tikal at its height would have been layered and complex in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from the silent stone of the surviving ruins. The constant background noise of the jungle, the birds and the insects and the howler monkeys, would have been present as it is today, forming the sonic environment within which all the human sounds of the city were embedded. To these natural sounds would have been added the sounds of construction, which would have been constant during the major building programs of the city's peak period. The crack and thud of stone being cut and shaped, the shouts of the workers coordinating the movement of heavy loads, the creak of the wooden scaffolding and the tackle used to lift stones to the upper levels of the pyramids under construction. The ritual life of the city would have filled the plazas with sounds that are largely lost to us. The beat of the large drums that accompanied ceremonial performances, the high notes of the ceramic and bone flutes whose fragments are found in excavations throughout the site, the deep resonance of the conch shell trumpets that were used to signal the beginning of important ceremonies, and above all the voices of the participants in the ritual performances that were the central public events of Maya civic life. The acoustics of the Great Plaza, which the researchers who have studied them believe were deliberately shaped to amplify and reflect sound in specific ways, would have made the voices of the officiants and the responses of the crowd into something more than ordinary speech, an element of the sonic environment of the ceremony as deliberate and as carefully managed as the visual elements. The smell of the city would have been dominated by the smoke of the cooking fires that were the constant companion of daily life in any pre-modern city, supplemented by the aromatic smoke of the copal incense that was burned in ritual contexts throughout the city and whose resinous, slightly sweet smell is still associated with Maya ritual practice today. The smell of the jungle itself, the rich organic complexity of a tropical forest in its constant cycle of growth and decay, would have been present at the edges of the cleared areas and wafting through the plazas on the morning breezes that move through the Petan forest at certain seasons. The physical experience of the city, the weight of the heat and humidity that characterize the Petan climate for most of the year, the hardness of the limestone under bare feet on the plaza surface, the dizzying height of the temple summits reached by the steep and narrow staircases, the coolness of the interior chambers at the hearts of the temples where the light barely penetrated. All of these physical qualities would have shaped the experience of the people who lived here in ways that the archaeology can suggest but not fully recover. The temples were designed to be physically demanding to approach, their steep staircases requiring an effort that prepared the climber for the ritual significance of what was encountered at the summit, and the physical geography of the ceremonial core was as much a part of its design as the carved stone and the painted plaster that decorated its surfaces. The long silence of Tikal, The period of more than 9 centuries between the last known inscription in 869 and the first systematic European investigation of the site in the mid-19th century was not a period of absolute isolation. The Maya people of the Petén did not disappear when the great cities of the classic period were abandoned. They reorganized themselves in smaller communities, many of them moving toward the lakes of the central Petén where fish and water resources provided a more reliable subsistence base than the increasingly depleted agricultural soils of the interior lowlands. The descendants of the Tikal population continued to inhabit the broader Petén region through the post-classic period and into the early colonial era, and the last independent Maya kingdom in what is now Guatemala, the Itzá state centered on Lake Petén Itzá, was not conquered by the Spanish until 1697, more than a century and a half after the initial Spanish conquest of the Maya highlands. During this long period, the ruins of Tikal were not entirely unknown to the people who lived in the region. The enormous stone structures, rising above the forest canopy, would have been visible for miles in the clearings created by slash-and-burn agriculture in the surrounding area, and the oral traditions of the Petén Maya communities surely contained knowledge of the ancient city and its history, even if that knowledge became more fragmentary with each passing generation. The site was occasionally visited. The evidence of post-classic period activity at several locations within the ruins suggests that people entered the site and used some of its spaces in the centuries following the abandonment, perhaps for their own ritual purposes or simply as a source of building material. The Spanish colonial presence in the Petén was minimal until the 17th century, and the region remained one of the least accessible parts of Mesoamerica throughout the colonial period. The forests that had protected the ancient city from easy discovery also protected the descendants of its inhabitants from the full force of the colonial disruption that transformed Maya society in the more accessible highlands. When the Spanish finally established effective control over the Petén in the 18th century, they found a landscape that still retained much of its ancient character, with the forest covering not only the ruins of the great classic cities but the evidence of the post-classic Maya communities that had inhabited the region in the intervening centuries. The silence of Tikal in the archaeological sense, the absence of new stone monuments and formal inscriptions after 869, was therefore not a silence of empty landscape but the silence of a different kind of human occupation, one that left fewer durable traces in the archaeological record, but that was no less real for that. The transition from the monumental city-state civilization of the classic period to the smaller-scale communities of the post-classic was a profound transformation, but it was not the end of Maya culture in the region, and the living Maya communities of today are the most direct evidence of that continuity. The specific cultural traditions that survived the classic collapse and that were maintained through the post-classic period and into the present include some of the most distinctive features of Maya civilization. The 260-day ritual calendar, which continues to be used by Maya daykeepers in the highlands of Guatemala in a living ritual tradition that traces its roots to the same calendrical system documented in the classic inscriptions of Tikal, the cosmological understanding of the world tree, and the three-part structure of the universe that underlies both classic Maya iconography and contemporary Maya ceremonial practice, and the social and kinship structures that organized Maya community life across the long centuries of transformation from the city-state civilization of the classic period to the colonial and post-colonial communities of the present. The legacy of Tikal in the contemporary world operates at several different levels simultaneously, from the global recognition of its archaeological and natural significance to the specific political and cultural meanings it carries for the people of Guatemala. The UNESCO World Heritage designation that Tikal received in 1979, making it one of the first sites in the world to be recognized for both its cultural and natural significance, placed it within a global framework of heritage conservation that has shaped how it has been managed and how it is perceived internationally. The designation brought international attention and resources to the site, contributed to the development of the tourism infrastructure that now serves the hundreds of thousands of visitors who come to Tikal each year, and established a set of international obligations for the Guatemalan government in the management of the site that have influenced the policies applied to it. The appearance of Tikal in popular culture has been one of the most effective means of bringing the site to the attention of a global audience that would not otherwise encounter it through the more specialized channels of academic publication or heritage tourism. The use of the Tikal ruins as a filming location for the original Star Wars film in 1977, in which the temples of the Central Core served as the rebel base on the jungle moon of Yavin 4, introduced the visual image of the site to an audience of hundreds of millions of people who had no prior knowledge of the Maya or of Tikal specifically. Whatever one thinks of the appropriateness of using an ancient Maya sacred site as a backdrop for a science fiction film, the effect of that use in generating global awareness of the site's existence and its visual character has been significant and largely positive for the site's visibility. The role of Tikal in Guatemalan national identity is complex and has evolved significantly over the post-independence history of the country. The image of the great temples has been used on Guatemalan currency and in official representations of the country as a symbol of the deep historical roots and the cultural grandeur of the national heritage, even as the living Maya communities who are the direct descendants of the builders of those temples have frequently been marginalized within the national political and social order. The contradiction between the celebration of the ancient Maya achievement as a component of national identity and the treatment of contemporary Maya people as second-class citizens within the Guatemalan state has been one of the central tensions of Guatemalan political culture. And the role of Tikal and other archaeological sites in this contradiction is something that Maya activists and scholars have consistently pointed out. The international scholarly community's engagement with Tikal has itself been an evolving relationship, one that has moved from the extraction-oriented archaeology of the early 20th century, which prioritized the recovery of objects and the documentation of monuments for foreign scholarly audiences, toward a more collaborative model in which Guatemalan and Maya scholars are central participants in the investigation and interpretation of the site. The development of Guatemalan archaeology as a discipline in its own right, with its own institutions, its own research programs, and its own theoretical frameworks that draw on the specific intellectual and cultural context of Guatemala rather than simply applying approaches developed for other archaeological traditions, has been one of the most significant developments in the study of the ancient Maya in the past half-century. The silence of the jungle over Tikal, the 9 centuries of forest growth that covered the plazas and climbed the temples and filled the spaces that had once been home to tens of thousands of people, is one of the more profound silences in the history of human civilization. It is not the silence of destruction. The temples are still standing. The plazas are still there beneath the grass. The carved monuments, those that have not been damaged by root growth or water infiltration or the occasional earthquake that shakes the petin, are still legible. The ancient city is not gone in the way that cities that were burned or plowed under are gone. It is simply covered, hidden beneath a living blanket of forest that has been growing over it for more than 1,000 years. This covering is also a preservation. The same forest that hid the city from the outside world protected it from the systematic looting that has damaged many more accessible archaeological sites. The same humidity that accelerated the deterioration of the lime plaster on the monument surfaces also created the anaerobic conditions in the sealed tombs that preserved the organic materials within them, the jade and shell and bone and cotton that would have disappeared in a drier environment. The jungle that reclaimed Tikal was not its enemy but its keeper, maintaining the ruins in a state of damaged but recoverable preservation through the long centuries of abandonment. The relationship between the ruins and the forest at Tikal today, the great ceiba trees growing from the summits of minor temples, the roots of strangler figs encasing the walls of ancient structures, the howler monkeys calling from the roof combs at dawn, is not simply a relationship between human achievement and natural process but something more like a partnership, an ongoing negotiation between the legacy of the ancient city and the living ecosystem that has grown up around and through it. The forest is not separate from Tikal. It is part of what Tikal is now, as much a part of the site's identity as the carved stone of the temples or the inscriptions that tell the history of the dynasty. The ceiba tree, which grows from the summits of several of the smaller temples at Tikal with a visual drama that has made those trees among the most photographed images associated with the site, was the world tree of Maya cosmology, the axis mundi that connected the three levels of the universe. The fact that ceiba trees grow on the ruins of Maya temples is not simply a botanical accident but a convergence of symbolic and ecological logic. The ceiba thrives in the disturbed ground and the extra light of partially cleared structures, and its presence on the temples gives those temples a quality of living memorial that no amount of architectural restoration could provide. The ancient Maya would have recognized immediately what the ceiba on the temple summit meant, and the recognition would have added another layer of meaning to a structure that was already freighted with symbolic significance. The people who will come to Tikal in the decades and centuries ahead will find a site that is still changing, still being shaped by the ongoing processes of forest growth and root pressure and water movement and biological activity that have been at work since the last inhabitants walked away. The archaeological work that will continue to be done at the site will continue to add to the understanding of what the city was. The conservation work that is required to preserve what remains against ongoing deterioration will require sustained commitment. And the negotiation between the archaeological significance of the site and the ecological significance of the forest that surrounds it, and between the international heritage framework within which the site is managed and the cultural rights of the Maya communities who understand it as their ancestral home, will continue to be one of the most complex and most important conversations in the management of the world's heritage. Standing in the great plaza of Tikal in the early morning, before the heat has built and before the first tour groups have arrived from the park entrance, the stillness is as complete as the stillness of any ancient place. The temples rise on either side of the plaza, their limestone surfaces darkened by moss and biological growth, their summits lost in the morning mist that fills the low areas of the jungle and drifts across the cleared space of the plaza at certain times of year. The howler monkeys, which have been roaring in the forest since before dawn, fall silent as the light strengthens, and in the quiet that follows their silence the other sounds of the jungle become audible. The calls of the birds that inhabit the forest and the ruins, the buzz of insects, the occasional sound of a branch or a leaf falling through the canopy somewhere in the surrounding trees. The plaza is not empty. The North Acropolis, the massive platform of superimposed temples that forms its northern wall, holds the accumulated construction of more than 1,000 years of Maya royal building, each new structure laid over its predecessors in a pattern of ritual renewal that began before the Classic period and continued until the very end of the city's active occupation. Beneath the Acropolis, in the sealed tombs that the excavations of the mid-20th century opened, lay the bodies of the kings who built this city, surrounded by the objects that expressed their power and their connection to the divine world. Those kings are gone, and the objects that accompanied them are in museums and storage facilities, but the stone structure that preserved them for more than 1,000 years still stands. The temples themselves, Temple I and Temple II facing each other across the plaza, are as physically present and as overwhelming in their scale as they were on the day they were completed, though the white plaster and the vivid color that covered them are long gone and the carved wood of the lintels that spanned their doorways has been replaced by replicas. The staircases that led to the summits, where the kings performed the rituals that connected the city to the gods, are still steep enough and still high enough to communicate something of the physical experience of the ascent, the effort and the exposure and the sudden open sky at the summit. The city that filled the forest around this plaza, the residential zones and the markets and the craft workshops and the smaller plazas and the satellite ceremonial centers, is still out there, still buried beneath the jungle and still being discovered, block by block and structure by structure, by the archaeologists who continue to work at the site. Most of it will never be excavated. Most of what the ancient city contained will remain in the earth. But what has been recovered is enough to know that what was built here was extraordinary, that the people who built it were extraordinary, and that the civilization they created, for all that it ended and was covered by the forest, was as fully human and as fully worthy of attention and admiration as any that the ancient world produced. If this film has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.